I've been asked 2 or 3 times, what am I going to preach on today? And I said, I didn't know. I first of all want to thank you for being here. We have a lot of guests here today, neighbors, family. My son Brian and 2 of the girls are here. Abby and Allison. Anna Claire is in a dance recital. I get to see her later on today. I think Chris would have been here, but they're having homecoming at the church where he preaches. As a matter of fact, I was reminded of the fact that in 1975, I started that church when I was preaching in Newport News. But I'm glad all of you were able to be here. My preacher buddy Lim and Marilyn are here today. I appreciate that so much. Lim had to make me feel bad coming in. He had to show me pictures of 3 big bass he caught this past week, and kind of made me envious of that. But I really appreciate you. Appreciate all the thoughts and the encouragement. And I remember the first sermon I ever preached was hard. I'm not sure it's as hard as this one. But before I get there, I want to thank the choir. I appreciate you singing and appreciate the songs you sang. Those were some of my favorite, and I appreciate the praise team and the songs you sang. You know, in May of 1959, May of night, some of you get, so what was that? That was the month that I became a Christian. I was just about a month shy of my 12th birthday. And from the day I became a Christian, I wanted to be a preacher. Talked about it. My home church started in my mom and dad's house. Now, prior to that, my dad and I would spend many weekends, Saturday and Sunday, on a creek bank somewhere, fishing. And I didn't know this until a few weeks before my dad died. He said, you know, you remember that time we went over to the Russell Fork River, down the mountain from the Breaks, Interstate Park, and we spent the weekend on that river? I said, yeah, remember it well. My dad said, I looked at you and my 2 cousins that were with us, all curled up on the bank, creek bank, laying up against huge rocks. He said, I thought, what if something happens to these boys? Why? They could be bitten by a rattlesnake or anything. He said, I made God a promise that if we got home safe, we'd be in church every Sunday after that. And we were. And shortly after that, I became a Christian. Now, through my teenage years, I was a lot like some of the rest of you. You know, I was a teenager, and I was a boy. And if you could kick it, bounce it, hit it, throw it, shoot it, I was all into it. And there was a period in my life I didn't talk a whole lot about being a preacher. Until one Sunday morning, the preacher, our preacher was preaching, and he was talking about serving God, and he came over and he looked at me and he said, Dave, you used to talk about being a preacher. Well, whatever happened to that? I felt about that big, but he was right. I was born on Sunday, about 11 o'clock. on a Sunday morning, June 22nd, 1947. I was born on the right day, born at church time. And long about the time then that I became about 16, 17 years old. I hadn't told Lisa this, but we were sitting at her kitchen table, her mom and dad's kitchen table. And I said, you know what, I think I'd like to go to Bible college. And I went to the preacher of the church where she attended, and I asked him, Clarence Greenleaf was his name. I said, preacher, I'd like to go to Bible college. Do you think you could help me get in? He says, why, honey, I'll pull every string I can pull. Because I figured they'd have to take some string pulling to get me in. Because I wasn't the best student. It wasn't that I wasn't smart. School, to me, was a social event, not a learning event. I hated snow days, really, because, man, that was your social life. And I graduated on good attendance. But I do appreciate you being here. I appreciate Bob McGuire being here today. Bob was the youth minister here when I came here years ago. But eventually, I wound up at Roanoke Bible College, and the reason I went to Roanoke Bible College in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, I knew nothing about it. Didn't even know it existed. I only knew 2 Bible colleges when I was a teenager. I knew about KCC, and I knew about Cincinnati Christian Seminary. But a representative from Roanoke Bible College came to Grundy, spoke at one of our youth groups, and I found out that Elizabeth City was about 70 miles from where my grandparents on my dad's side lived. They owned a farm. And I thought, oh boy, I can go to school there, and then on the weekends I can go up and hunt and fish. That was my only reason. You know, it's interesting. We have been talking about the upper story and the lower story as we go through the Bible. All of us have a lower story. Did you know that? But there's an upper story where God is working. And unbeknown to me, God, I think, was working. And I had all these plans down here, and if God can smile, he was just smiling and said, yeah, you think so? Okay, we'll see. Now, I did get to go up and spend weekends with my grandparents, and they were great weekends. But eventually, after a year or 2, my weekends were taken up and probably speaking at some church somewhere. But it was all a part of the development. 1986, I was preaching in Grundy, a little place called Poplar Creek. You go to Grundy, and then you go 2 miles up and 2 miles down, and you're on Poplar Creek. I think it was April 6th, 1986, was the first time I ever laid eyes on horse pasture. As far as coming to church here. Used to drive through here all the time, traveling back and forth from Grundy to Elizabeth City. Never dreamed I'd ever live here. But April 6, 1986, I came for a trial sermon. And then the first Sunday in June of that year, we moved in. I remember Linda, my wife then, and the boys, we stopped over around near Richlands, Virginia, or Tazewell, someplace. There was a church there having photos made of individuals and families. I don't remember how my wife learned about it, but on the way here, we stopped and did a family photo. It's kind of weird. But the first day I ever walked in this church, I felt like I'd been here all my life. It was almost like this is the place. And so for the next 9 years and 4 months, this was the place. But then I was nearing 50 years old then. When I came here, I'm the same age Kyle is right now. You're 38. I was 38 years old when I came here to be the preacher. And then when I was nearing 50, I thought, when you get 50, nobody wants you. So if I was ever going to make a move, I better make a move now. But I never put out any feelers. I just prayed, God, if it's time for me to go somewhere else, if it's time to make a transition, please let me know. And I don't think it was maybe a month or two later. 3 guys came to church here. A friend of mine was retiring from the church in Charlottesville, and they said, the preacher, retiring preacher said, you are the man he wants to replace you. I thought, well, God, I appreciate that answer. That's pretty quick. And of course, there were other things that were being part of the decision. But I remember the night that I resigned from the ministry here. And I wish Shirley was here today. She would laugh at this. She reamed me out big time. And if you've ever been reamed out by Shirley Holland, buddy, you know what it's like, right, Clyde? And Daryl did the same thing. Daryl took me to the office, and it was like being taken to the woodshed when your pop, took you out there and gave you a whipping. But again, there was an upper story to all of this, not just the lower story. Because those 6 years I spent in Charlottesville, that's where I needed to be. Because it was there that Linda was diagnosed with cancer. And I could see the top of the hospital from my home. We were right where we needed to be. And oddly enough, we were instrumental. God used us to help start another church across Monticello Mountain that's called the Lake Christian Church. And you remember Chris Long that preached a revival here a few years ago? Chris was one of the young men I baptized while in Charlottesville. He is now the preacher at that church. So there were things God, I think, had for us to do. And then lo and behold, about the time I felt like I was done there, and I remember telling Linda, I said, I'm either going to quit the ministry or I'm going to crack up. It was very stressful. And I did send out a couple of letters to churches, but they didn't want me. And lo and behold, it opened up, I could come back home to horse pasture. And I really believe God was in it all. I really do. And it's amazing how God has blessed and what has been accomplished, not by me, but by God. The people, the people in this congregation, you are unlike any other place I've ever ministered, seriously. And I have said in every place I've ever preached, from Indiana, in revivals to all the way across this state, that this is the best church that I've ever been in. You are. Not because of you. It's not about us, is it? But it's about the one who lives in us. It's about who we serve. It's about the Lord. You've heard this story. You've heard all my stories. I can't tell you an original story. So, but as I often say, I'm old enough now that I can repeat myself and you be polite and laugh. But there was a preacher who went to a church one time, and the church had a bad reputation. They went through preachers, like some women go through shoes, You got to buy a new pair every week. But this preacher went to this church, and lo and behold, he realized one day he'd been there about 10 years. Wow, he had set the record. And he's feeling pretty good about himself. And so he asked one of the leaders in the church, said, what do you think it is that contributes to my longevity here? And he was thinking that they're going to tell about his great preaching or his great abilities and so forth. And the guy said, well, I got to be honest with you. Before you came here, we didn't really want a preacher. And you're about the nearest nothing we could find. Well, it's time for the nearest nothing to go somewhere else. And but I'll probably think of 1,000 things after I quit that I should have said. But I thank you for your love, your patience. Thank you for ministering to me through one of the most difficult times of my life. A little over a year or so ago, I thought the world had come to an end. And for the most part at that time, mine had. But again, I think God takes care of us. He watches out over us. I'll never forget the people. Many of those great people that were so good to me are no longer with us. But we'll all be with them one day. Amen. We're all on a journey. And we want to make it through. Now, I don't want to go on real long, but I do want to say something very important. I figure there's 3 groups of people here this morning. There's one group of saved people. You know the Lord. You serve the Lord. And if Jesus came today, it'd be the greatest day of your life. And there's another group of people. You're a drifting group. You're a lukewarm group. If Jesus came today, you'd say, I don't know if I want him to come today. I'm not quite ready. And maybe you're not ready. You're not really serious about your walk with God. You got just enough religion to make you happy, but not enough, or to make you miserable, but not enough to make you happy. You're on and off. You'll serve the Lord if you got time, or if there's nothing else on your schedule. But for the most part, Jesus is on the back burner of your life. And then there's a third group of people here today. You're lost. You don't know the Lord. You know about him, but you don't know him. You keep saying one of these days, I'm going to become a Christian, but you don't. You keep waiting, and you're just not serious. 2 Corinthians 6, 1 and 2 says, as God's fellow workmen, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. For he says, in the time of my favor I heard you, and in the day of salvation I helped you. I tell you, now is the time of God's favor. Now is the day of salvation. When is the best time to be saved? Today. Because today is all we have. We have no promise of tomorrow. Hebrews 3:7 and 8 says, so as the Holy Spirit says today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your heart. Just which one of those three groups do you see yourself in today? Let me try to share with you in just a moment or two why I think everybody ought to be saved today. You ought to know Jesus today. You ought to be a Christian today. You ought to be serving God today. First of all, you ought to be saved today because of the result of sin in your life. By the means of sin, the devil is out to destroy every single one of us. He wants to enslave us. And we need to realize that we are either a slave to sin or we're a slave to Christ. There's no middle ground, folks. You're not going to stand before God one day and say, well, God, I wasn't for you, but I wasn't against you. Jesus said, if you're not for me, you're against me. Paul says in Romans chapter 6, don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as a slave, you are slaves to the one whom you obey, whether you are a slave to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. Jesus said, you can't serve two masters. Willful service to sin will eventually lead to death. What is it John says in Revelation 20? Then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. Earth and sky fled away from his presence, and there was no more place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades, the grave, gave up the dead that were in them, and each person was judged according to what he had done. Then death and hell, or Hades, were thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire is the second death. Now let's define death for just a moment. Death means separation. When my spirit leaves this body, my body will be dead. Sin causes at least 3 deaths. There is, first of all, spiritual death, separation from God. Isaiah 59:2 says, but your iniquities have separated you from your God. Your sin has hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. Remember what God told Adam and Eve? Don't eat of the forbidden fruit, because the day that you eat thereof, you'll die. Many people can read that and say, well, see, they didn't die. Yes, they did. They died spiritually. Their sin, their disobedience separated them from God. They were estranged from God. Then there's physical death. Separation of the spirit from the body. Romans 5:12, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all have sinned. If Jesus tarries, you and I will die. Eventually, the body will die. Sin brought this ultimate end upon all mankind. In the 31 years that I've been the preacher here, we've had to deal with a lot of death. I've been back here since 2001. And in those years, I've preached 179 funerals. But then there's eternal death, the second death that John talked about in Revelation, the eternal state of dying, but never reaching the state of unconsciousness. No separation from pain. And I promise you, I have sat by the bedside of many dying Christians, many dying saints, and you're praying for that moment to come when the spirit is released from that body of pain so that they can know peace. That second death is described as an eternal death, a death where you are eternally dying but never reaching that point where you are freed from the pain. That's the second death. I don't know about you, but I don't want that. But what about the results of sin in this life? And I submit to you that we must reckon with the results of sin even in this life. You don't have to wait till the time you die and face God. Even in this life, sin deals with us. Like the man who spent over 30 years in the penitentiary up in the state of Ohio. And what had happened, he owned a farm. A railroad was coming through, and they wanted to take part of his farm, and it would divide his farm, and he didn't want that. But they condemned his property, took his property, built the railroad, and one night there was a terrible railroad derailment. Several people were killed. He was suspected of doing something to derail the train. He was convicted of it and was in prison. His farm was sold. He became a millionaire, but he was in prison. Now, it only took a short period of time to do whatever he did to cause the derailment that took people's lives. But he spent the rest of his life paying for it. Friends, there are consequences to actions. There are consequences to sin. Yes, God's mercy and forgiveness is wonderful, and it's true, and it happens. But even in this life, we have to deal with the consequences of choices we make. No wonder the Bible says to remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before those evil days come. There are other examples of that in the Bible. Look at Moses. Moses was forbidden to enter the promised land because he disobeyed God. Look at David's life. Oh my, the man who's described as the man after God's own heart had to deal with the results of sin in his own life. The baby died that Bathsheba conceived in their adulterous affair. David's son, Ammon, raped his daughter. And Absalom, loving his sister, hated Ammon and killed Ammon, his half-brother. And then later on, Absalom led the people against David and led a revolt. And Absalom, in turn, was slain. The man after God's own heart had to deal with his own bad choices. And friends, that's why we need to avoid sin. What did David do? He repented before God. If you want to read one of the most stirring, emotional scriptures in the Bible, read the 51st Psalm. So, we cannot sin and get by with it. We have to call on God. We have to come to God. So everyone ought to be a Christian today, ought to be saved today because of the possibility of the results of sin in your own life. And one other reason, you ought to be saved today and a Christian because the power of influence that you have on other people. Now, someday you may become a Christian if you're not today. And you may die and go to heaven. But what about the people whom you will influence between now and that time? Every day our influence leads someone to do right or wrong. Now, you may not even know it. You say, "No, my life doesn't, nobody looks at my life." Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And you'd be surprised at the people that notice you and follow your example. Paul says in Romans 14:7, "For none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone." Don't kid yourself. You influence people. Our influence affects someone else. Many years ago when I preached in Newport News, I used to do home Bible studies, and I was doing a home Bible study with this family that had just moved there. I had a lot of military people, and this guy was a major in the United States Army. Visited our church, started a Bible study in their home. About the second week, Grandma came to stay with them. I'll never forget her. Her name was Mrs. Hagman, and she had about 6 children. And she would go and live about 6 months with each one of her children. And that really worked. I thought it was great. But they also had other children. They had a little boy, and they had this 14-year-old girl. Prettiest little girl you've ever seen. Long blonde hair, big blue eyes, just as cute as a bug in a rug. And whenever I'd go over to have the Bible study, she'd always go upstairs. She would never come to the Bible study. And sometimes the music she was playing upstairs would interrupt our Bible study downstairs. I couldn't get anywhere near that young lady to talk to her about the Lord. She was not interested in anything I had to say. Well, Miss Hagman lived there with them for about 3 or 4 months. And you know, Miss Hagman was not a Christian. And that was odd. For a lady in her 70s, had never made any statement of faith of any kind in her life. But I was blessed to be able to baptize her and her son and his wife. The last Sunday Miss Hagman was with us, she came back down the aisle. You know who she had with her? That little 14-year-old girl. Her grandmother brought her to Christ. Now, grandparents, let me tell you, you have powerful, powerful influence. When I first came here, there was a lady that lived over on Wagon Trail. Many of you will remember her, Marie McCormick. And Marie was diagnosed with cancer. And I remember some of the folks here said, "We want you to go see Marie. Go talk to Marie." And we did. Baptized Marie. Marie had a dad. He was up in his 80s. He was not a Christian. And from the time she became a Christian till the time she died, she witnessed to her father and won him to the Lord Jesus. Jerry and Glenette Hagan. Andrew's not here today, is he? You know, I remember something Andrew said years ago before Jerry and Glenette ever started back to church. Andrew said, he went to one of them, I guess it was his mother. Jerry was probably out playing music somewhere. Andrew said to his mother or someone, said, "How old do you got to be before you can go to Sunday school?" Y'all didn't know that, did you? Your influence. You have influence, and that's why you ought to be saved today, so you can influence people. And then one other. You should become a Christian today or be saved today because you might be in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. Some of you will remember the name of Joe Pruitt. Joe Pruitt and his family I had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And they came to church here. Kind of sporadic, but they came. The girls were, children were involved in the youth group. And one day, Joe came to me and he said, I need to talk to you. And Joe began to reveal the problems he had in his life. Joe was addicted to alcohol. And Joe told me a lot of things about him I didn't know. He was either the head, he was the head of the x-ray department over at the hospital. He said, I go home, I stop at the old country store, I'll get a 6 or a 12 pack, and I drink until I go to sleep at night. I get up the next morning, go to work. And it was starting to take its toll. And God was working with him. And he says, I need some help. And I remember calling the elders together in this church, and we prayed with and for Joe. And Joe did what he needed to do to get things right with God. It was graduation weekend. I was on my way to the store to get something. I think my son Chris and what was the oldest daughter's name? Heather graduated the same year. And as I went off the bypass, I saw there was a traffic accident. And I stopped and I realized it was Joe and at least one of the girls and little Joe. Little Joe was sitting in the median. That's a little boy. And I could tell he was in shock. And as I went by, I asked somebody, get a blanket and wrap that kid up, he's in shock. And I went to the driver's side, and the daughter was driving, and I know she had a big cut on her eye and a cut on her knee, and I saw they were pulling Joe out the other side. And when I saw the rescue man hit him in the chest, I knew he was in trouble. And we went to the hospital and found out Joe had passed. So I had to go tell, Jolene was his wife's name. And that's that Joe had passed. And I remember spending the night there along with the youth minister at the hospital. Even held a couple of kids while the doctor sewed them up. It was about a month or two between the time Joe got his life straightened out that he's in eternity. You think of that. God may be giving you time to get it together. Today may be the day to get it together. Because tomorrow, you might be in the presence of God. I waved to Charlie Bradshaw as I went past his house. And 2 hours later, I was at the accident where the tree fell on him and Sherry. Happens that quick. Now, which one of those 3 groups are you in this morning? And I could make no other appeal to you today as I leave you as the minister of this church. I appeal to you, if you're not saved, friends, please consider where you are, where you could be, and if you don't know Jesus, where you will be. Because that's important. If today you knew that you would pray your last prayer, what would you pray for? And if you knew that today was your last day, what would you do? Now, the fact is, The time is coming, listen friends, the time's coming when we will pray our last prayer. And we'll live our last day. And I know some people think, well, I'll wait right before I die and I'll just make it right. But how do you know you're going to be in shape to do that? You could have a heart attack or a stroke, and you can lie unconscious for days, weeks, months, even years, and have no mind to make any decision. The Bible is true. Today is the day of salvation. Don't harden your heart. Don't make excuses. And if heaven, listen, if heaven is the best thing that God could offer, why in the world would you want to delay? And if hell is the worst thing that you could ever imagine, why would you want to take a chance? Today. Guys, come and sing. If you have a decision to make, today is the day to make that decision. Today's time to make it right with God. Don't delay. Don't put it off. If you've just been playing around with the Christian faith, you know, it's kind of like you buy fire insurance thinking, okay, well, I'm safe now, and you go, and don't live your Christian life that way. Get involved. That's the way God is. But there's a decision you need to make as we stand and as we sing. Would you come?